Today I'm going to walk you through the essential process of performing descriptive statistics, and I'll also highlight just how incredibly crucial this initial step is whenever you conduct any form of analysis. For this demonstration, as is our usual practice, I'll be utilizing the platform known as the Financial Research Gate. We'll begin by carefully selecting the single frequency and annual data options, and for our initial exploration, we'll choose to include the entire sample. I'm going to use this regarding the DuPont equation. So for this analysis, I'm going to select the profit to margin ratio as one of the key components, and then I'm going to pick asset turnover. And I'm going to pick the concept of market leverage, or the leverage ratio, which is the debt ratio, a very important financial metric to consider. These three distinct components, when carefully considered together, according to the widely recognized and fundamental DuPont equation, collectively explain the company's overall return on equity performance. Now, once we've selected the X and Y values, I'm also going to select a size variable pause. This is included just in case we might want to categorize the different variables for our analysis, either by their specific size or perhaps by their book-to-market ratio, which is widely recognized as a key measure of a company's future growth opportunities. For instance, we could distinguish between high-value and low-value firms, or alternatively, between high-growth and low-growth firms. Once we are done, of course, we must not forget to change the Y variable to the return on equity measurement, the principal dependent variable in this study. Then we'll scroll further down. Let's focus on the descriptive statistics in order to fully understand the underlying data. The first thing that we immediately notice here is the presence of an extreme level of outliers, which is clearly indicated by the significant variation within the dataset. Consequently, we must carefully examine both the measures of central tendency and the overall variation. Now, the maximum value we've observed is quite distant from the 99th percentile, which strongly suggests the presence of a few extremely large outlier observations. And if we choose to retain these particular observations in our dataset, we will significantly distort the overall results of our analysis. For instance, if you were to perform an OLS regression, the resulting coefficients would simply not be considered reliable. Therefore, it's imperative that we take some meaningful action to address this. The same principle holds true for the average and the wealthiest 1% of the population. What we observe is a truly significant and concerning deviation. Well, another important point we should consider is that we can analyze the descriptive data on a yearly basis and to determine whether that particular deviation continues to exist in the coming years. And it certainly appears that this is indeed the situation, as we can clearly see right here. Let's take, for example, the mean and then also the median value. You are able to select the entire median data column and then proceed to make changes to it so you can easily compare the outcomes. If there are significant differences between the mean and median, it's likely due to extreme observations. You can see this clearly from the maximum and minimum values. So, for instance, in this case, you might encounter a 3-digit number. However, in certain years, you'll find numbers with 4 or perhaps even 6 or potentially more digits. Consequently, this issue of varying length persists from one year to the next. So the very first thing I'll be doing is transforming this particular variable. A logarithmic transformation isn't really an option here, as we're dealing with negative values, which is quite typical for a profit margin. If we apply the logarithmic transformation, we are going to shift the position of all of them, and we absolutely must retain these specific observations because they are a crucial component of the entire data set. However, we can instead apply the Windsorization technique. The fundamental idea of the Windsorization is that we are going to set any value that is extremely high, let's say the 99th percentile, or any value that falls below the first percentile is considered equal to that specific percentile value. For instance, if I were to select 1%, and when I apply Windsorization to this data, specifically within each individual year, what happens is that any data point or observation that falls above the 99th percentile will then be adjusted and set to be exactly equal to that 99th percentile value. Similarly, any data point that falls below the first percentile will be set equal to that first percentile value. So let me now select a specific year. And of course, it's absolutely essential that we don't forget to select all of the relevant variables for our equation. We can choose from all of the options here. Size is not considered a primary independent variable. However, we are able to select all of them, and subsequently we can then proceed to create a Windsorized variable. Now, after we've completed this task, these are the old variables. Let's take a moment to carefully examine the characteristics of this newly generated variable. You'll notice immediately that the previous problem concerning an excessively high maximum value has now been completely resolved. This is primarily due to the fact that the maximum value now aligns quite closely with the 99th percentile, and we observe a very similar situation here with the minimum value, which is now close to the first percentile. Also, year by year, if you carefully examine the data, you will no longer observe any extremely high or unusual maximum values, and consequently, the standard deviation became significantly lower. Regarding the profit margin, you should not be checking these particular variables. I must emphasize again, these are indeed the older variables. You'll want to go and take a look at the new variable that we've just created. As an example, let's consider the asset turnover value that we have here. You'll notice that its standard deviation is not nearly as large as it was before, and you'll also find that the mean and the median values can now be quite close to each other. They are not really that far from one another. Same thing applies to the remaining variables. All right. As a final crucial step, we should then proceed to check the descriptive bisector after the Windsorization has been performed to determine if there are any issues with the data. And up until this very moment, if we take a careful look at, for instance, the crucial relationship between the total profit and the operational margin. And now let's bring up the median values of the Windsorized profit margin right alongside the minimum profit margin. Pause. What we can see is that in most sectors, these two figures are quite close to one another. Pause. The notable exception here is the healthcare sector. It's the only area where we might encounter a significant issue with the profit margin even after our initial assessment. The reason is you might encounter newly listed firms, and these newly listed firms could exhibit quite extreme performance, either in a positive direction or a negative direction. You could address this by excluding the entire healthcare sector, or you might choose to retain it, or perhaps investigate this matter more deeply by identifying these specific firms. It is entirely up to you to decide whether to retain these particular elements within the sample, as that choice will naturally depend on the specific objectives of your study. However, apart from that consideration, we currently do not observe any significant red flags or major concerns within the collected data. Therefore, it is now considerably safer to confidently proceed with the subsequent analysis. And you can go ahead and run the regression analysis. Pause. Now, the final thing that you are able to do within this particular menu is to select the option for descriptive statistics broken down by group, which essentially means that you can describe
the sample was clearly influenced or perhaps affected by some kind of external factor. This is precisely the reason why I chose to select the size variable.
You have the capability to select a specific measurement, pause for instance the overall size, pause, and utilize that particular dimension as the variable that you wish to summarize.
These are the specific variables we'll require to generate the summary. So I'll proceed by selecting all of the X variables. Now, in my study, I had initially included book to market, but that really shouldn't be here, so I'm going to remove it. Now, the variable that I'm going to use to split is here, not here. And I'm going to choose, for example, size. You can pick the one you visualize or the original variable, it doesn't matter. It's just a splitting variable. And I'm going to
Do it.
Could you please tell me how many groups you're able to select?
Okay, so in this step, you'll need to choose the option for quantile. This is because we'll be dividing our sample into groups according to the quantile values of the size variable. You will have to select the quantile again. You'll just need to give it a few moments, and then you can go ahead and select the size.
And you have the ability to create and manage 5 separate groups. I believe the max here is 10.
Oh, wait, I need to correct that. Sorry, it's actually 20. Yes, 20. So, here we are presenting the descriptive statistics categorized by the size of the organization. So, regardless of whether you are looking at a small firm or a very large corporation, you can clearly observe that the resulting financial numbers do not really differ significantly. This initial analysis focuses specifically on the median asset turnover ratio, and we can quickly proceed to perform the same analysis for the leverage metrics. We are not observing any substantial differences in the data, so the information does not show any significant heterogeneity when we look at the variable of size. Pause. Now, let's transition to the next key performance indicator. We must take a closer look at the profit margin itself. Let's thoroughly examine the profit margin. Yes, the average profit margin figure itself clearly indicates significant differences depending on the scale of operation. For example, when we look at smaller firms, their profit margin is quite small and restricted, but if we shift our focus to the larger corporations, we find that their margins are considerably higher and more substantial. So we observe that there's a degree of heterogeneity present when we consider the size factor, and then you're able to perform precisely the same kind of analysis using the book-to-market ratio. Now, the primary reason for conducting this analysis is to allow you to perform a thorough robustness test at the conclusion of your study. This is achieved by splitting the regression based on firm size, specifically to demonstrate whether the relationship remains consistent across smaller entities versus larger corporations. The primary motivation for undertaking this analysis was that when we performed the initial descriptive statistics, specifically segmented by company size, we observed quite significant differences in the resulting profit margins. It is also highly probable that we would find similar results or the same pattern of variation when examining other key financial metrics, such as asset turnover or market leverage. We did not observe any truly significant differences, which suggests that this is purely a matter of increasing the profit margin. And that's the reason why we will perform the robustness test, which involves splitting the regression based on firm size. Thus, scrolling down a bit further, you can now proceed to run the regression. You must, of course, not forget to carefully select the once transformed variable. Specifically, that would be the once transformed y variable for your analysis. Here is the y variable because there's no explicit notation. So by default, we'll consider it the first derivative of y. For the first derivative of x, you'll clearly see the variable written out. Therefore, I'm going to select the asset turnover, market leverage, and profit margin, which are components of the DuPont equation. And you can even split that regression into several distinct parts for analysis. By way of example, such as you could potentially split that based on the profit margin, and you can select the number of groups, for example 3, so you're going to perform the regression analysis within each group of profit margin ranging from the low group to the high group. Once all the initial preparations are complete, you will then have the flexibility to choose your desired clustering option. Additionally, you can carefully adjust the robustness parameter specifically for handling potential errors, and subsequently, you are free to select the OLS model. And here you'll observe the outcome of the regression analysis. You can then proceed to compare the specific findings presented in each result. Overall, and this was precisely as we had anticipated, the turnover demonstrates a clear positive relationship and the p-value is indeed statistically significant. Market leverage is negatively related to ROE, which stands for return on equity. Profit margin, of course, is expected to relate positively. So that is expected as predicted by the DuPont model. Thank you for watching.